Good morning and welcome to our first webinar of the year, the Google Core Update. I hope you're all well during these difficult and interesting times. My name is Jonathan and I'm the head of sales here at Keel Over Marketing. And before we get started, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping. If you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will endeavor to answer them at the end. And then without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sam Jones, who is the head of SEO of Keel Over Marketing.
Morning, everyone. So I'm going to try and keep this relatively quick and painless for everyone. What we're going to try and do today is run through the new update that's coming in May. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in the context of the Lighthouse tool, which has been in action for quite a while now. Look at the most common issues facing websites within that. Let you obviously know why this is important, and then move to the kind of three new things that are being introduced. So first off, it's really important to understand Google's existing performance metrics. So Google's currently analyzing your website against four kind of core groups of metrics using their Lighthouse tool. Lighthouse is an open source automated tool for basically improving quality of web pages. For a lot of you, this stuff also, some of it sits within your search console. So you can look at things like cumulative layout shift and some of the new factors that we'll be talking about later within that. But basically, we're looking at four kind of groups of things: performance, accessibility, best practices, and SEO. Best practices really is security, but it does cover a few other things. Obviously, these are just a few of the factors that Google's looking at when it decides where to rank your website. But obviously, because there's a new update, Google's kind of re-highlighting the kind of importance of this. And at the moment, about 15% of websites will actually kind of pass this audit tool. So it's kind of important that we get on top of it now. Since Google announced this, they've tracked a 70% increase in people using their Lighthouse tool. So obviously a lot of people are trying to get on top of this stuff. And the reason it's kind of so important is that all of this stuff is aimed at providing a better experience for web users. You know, it's less about the traditional SEO of optimizing your keywords and building backlinks. It's basically just about making sure that anyone using your page is getting the best, securest, safest possible experience that they can. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn quickly, and then we'll move on to the new updates. So the first issue is performance, which is obviously the big one. I obviously look at hundreds of websites. Most websites are really low on this score. This is the one that gives people the most issues, because basically Google's asking us to deliver a fast website to visitors. And part of the reason this in particular gets put on such a back burner is because you hear it all the time. It's like, well, our website's perfectly fast. And it's true in most cases that when you're actually using a website, it's quite quick. But what Google's trying to really take into account is that we don't have this kind of uniformity of device and internet speeds. And actually, whilst a website might load really quickly on the latest iPhone, there's still a massive percentage of the market that's not using the most up-to-date technologies and not using phones or traditional desktop browsers that are actually able to render your content quick enough. And that's why this is the one that gets overlooked, but it's also the one why it's the most important, because we want to ensure that a website is delivering for every user the best possible experience that it can. So the big performance metrics are the page speed, time to interactivity, which is how long it takes your page to become usable, and the last page, how long it takes to load everything on that page. So the most common issues here are the first being poor server response times. And this is something you should be measuring and testing. And if you're getting poor performance from your server, it's time to upgrade your server or optimize your server. Check how it is loading, compressing all of the content of your web pages. The next big one, very few sites have got on top of this, is next-gen images, which is WebP, JPEG 2000 and JPEG XR. The reason we've been quite slow to adopt these is because different browsers use different ones, but essentially they're just much better optimized images than traditional JPEGs. If you're on a WordPress site, there's some plugins that can do this, like Smush, or you can use a CDN like Cloudflare to do a lot of this heavy lifting for you. But it's all got to be done on the server side. You know, it's not about uploading a WebP image. It's about having a process that outputs the correct images at the correct time. And the third one is not using lazy loading, and that's basically you'll get this a lot from me. It's all about deferring stuff we're not using. The lazy loading is loading stuff that's below the fold when you first load a page. It's loading that stuff all afterwards, so that what we're doing is getting the user a usable and visible page as quickly as possible, and then we can worry about everything else that page has got going on afterwards, because that's, you know, how we deliver a better experience. So the second set of metrics is accessibility, and this is really, you know, the traditional sense of accessibility. Google wants us to deliver a web page that is usable for everybody, whether they're using a screen reader, whether they've got, you know, poor eyesight, anything like that. So it's literally about how accessible, friendly your pages are, and whether every visible item on your page is correctly identified to people that might be using screen readers, or, you know, correctly labeled images, that kind of stuff. So the most common issues are having your links and buttons mislabeled, and that is the classic of just being like click here or like read more, where you're basically using non-descriptive text to describe a functionality. And for screen readers, they can't differentiate that content, so they'll just be reading click here. And obviously without contextualizing those kind of links, you're not actually allowing people to find the content they need. So the next up is a much more visual thing, and that's using insufficient contrast ratios. You can obviously see I've put this on a very clear black-white, very strong contrast ratio. And a lot of websites use a very traditional kind of design where you've got three colors that kind of fade into each other. And obviously the problem with that is if you've got poor eyesight, it's actually quite difficult to differentiate parts of the page. So getting a really good contrast ratio, making everything stand out the way it should, is kind of the easy way to solve that. And the last, most common and simplest, is just alt tags, which is the little bit of code you use to tell a screen reader and Google what an image is. People tend to just have these as like image one, or they'll have them as you know, product one, and it will just be the name of the product, but it won't be a description of it. So kind of increasing your accessibility, but also increasing your SEO optimization opportunities on your pages, and making sure everything that needs an alt tag has one. And what we see all the time looking at designs is that there'll be bits within the kind of template that don't have it, whether that's the like credit card links or the little Facebook icons and things like that, where Google's going to pick you up on that, even though it's not something that's necessarily going to massively impact users. Google still wants you to be showcasing that, you know, that expertise and accessibility. So the third one is best practice, which I've kind of said, it's about having no errors on the page and having no security issues. Obviously, most of you are aware that we did the switch to HTTPS, but most people have managed to switch their domains successfully, but a lot of people haven't actually done all of the internal resources. So what we often find is that there's just, you know, a few links or a few image links that have HTTP still. Quick fix: run searchdb to replace in your database and just change HTTPS to HTTP to HTTPS. Might break your site occasionally, but it's the quickest way to fix things. The next is outdated JS, JavaScript, because that often has security vulnerabilities. And it's the same with unsafe links. Any link you have that takes someone kind of off a page even if it's a Facebook or Twitter link, should be using a rel no opener or rel no referrer tag. This basically, it's really complicated. It basically prevents anything you open to creating a kind of like separate version of your page and using your page data, which can create vulnerability and security. And the last one, unfortunately, it's a bit of a catch-all, which is browser errors. And basically, this is when a page tries to execute an action or output something, but the browser can't actually make that happen. So it just logs these errors in your browser. And you actually just have to go and do those manually. A lot of the time, it will just be like an outdated bit of code or a missing image or something like that, where it's trying to load an asset that doesn't exist. And the last one is SEO. It's not SEO in the kind of traditional sense. It's kind of more about the way a page is actually structured and works and is readable. So obviously we need it to be indexable. We need Google to be able to actually, pull out all of our content. They need to understand how that content flows and read it, and understand how that page links into all of your other pages. Most common problems here, missing hrefs. This is normally in menu structures, actually. It's a really interesting one because normally a lot of people, if you have your top menu and you click your top menu and it opens up, but a lot of people still they're using an A tag for that click menu open button. So Google's trying to think that it's a link, but obviously it's not a link. And just adding the href there just helps Google understand what that menu's doing. Second is invalid rel canonicals. These are the most misused thing in SEO, probably. It's making sure you've got your either self-referentials or your actual correct canonical tags from page to page, so that Google understands how these pages kind of sit with each other. And then the last and most simplest is missing doc data of various types. So whether that's your language tag in the header, the alts that we've already talked about, or your meta titles, H1s, descriptions. Having missing data makes it harder for Google to understand and read your page, essentially. And this is the stuff that, as SEOs, we're always on top of, but a lot of people aren't. So that's kind of where we are. And then Google, in its infinite wisdom, is introducing a few more things to the mix. And these are a little bit more complicated, some of them, but I'm going to go through them all and kind of hopefully give you some understanding of them. So this is the kind of the core web vitals. So we've got the four below that we've just talked about, and then we're putting loading, interactivity, and visual stability, which have got three kind of key points for them. Google has intimated, but not confirmed, that it is it's trialing, putting an actual visual indicator within SERPs of whether your site meets the page experience requirements of Google. So as well as being a ranking factor, this is also going to be a factor that affects your click-through rates to your website. Because if someone can see that your site ticks all the boxes across security, interactivity, everything, they're much more likely to engage with you, because Google's telling them that yours is a good site. So these kind of three new elements are kind of core to delivering that. So the first one is largest content for paint. A bit of a mouthful, but basically it's how long it takes the main element of your content to fully load, whether that is a big text box, a flagship image, or a banner or something. Whatever's going to take up the biggest chunk of space, essentially, and they want that to load in less than 2.5 seconds. So again, we're looking at similar issues, like common things that cause this. Your server, again, always start with the server. It's also the easiest thing to fix, because you can just upgrade your server. Render blocking JavaScript and CSS. That's basically when you're running all your JS and CSS beforehand, so it's putting a drain on the time that it can actually load assets. We're going to talk about this in a lot more detail, because this is something that's can be quite hard to do. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes you're just running a load of unnecessary plugins or stuff that you can kind of throw back a little bit in the load. But sometimes it's a bit more serious, where you just got actually too much code on this page trying to execute. The other is just slow resource load times when you're trying to load, like if you're trying to load a giant image that's not the correct size and not being output at the correct size, that's going to bring your stuff right down. And the last is using client-side rendering. So I don't want to get too technical, but basically there's two kinds of rendering, which is server-side and client-side. Server-side, you're relying on your server to deliver all of the information. Client-side, you're basically relying on the client's browser to output with the information. Nowadays, you can use a bit more of a mixed approach where you do as much as you can server-side and then do some client-side to deliver a faster experience, a faster app, like load, essentially. So that's kind of the last issue. We always want to start with the simplicity stuff. So we start with the servers, we start with the resources, and we see where that gets us. And we really need to look at the kind of more complicated stuff if, you know, the first few things aren't actually getting us the results we need. So the next is first input delay. And this is basically how long it takes your page to actually be usable, because part of a good user experience is actually, you know, if I click on a link, I want to be able to use that page, whether it's scrolling on that page, clicking through, opening text boxes, whatever that is. And obviously, the longer we delay that, the worse user experience we get. And Google wants us to aim for less than 100 milliseconds. And what you've also got to remember is what I said earlier. This isn't just about how good it is on the latest iPhone. You've got to deliver this experience for people that don't have the technology, or that, you know, are just running an old model. You know, it's like, imagine trying to load a web page on a like Nokia 3310 or something. You'd be there for 12 days, but it's that kind of difference. Most of the country is not on iPhones or whatever. So these issues are a little bit more complicated. It's JavaScript bloat again. This is always JavaScript. Long chains, heavy JS use. Anything that's registering when you use the tools, it's like over 50 milliseconds. You've got to shorten that down, because, you know, you can see that's already half your budget gone in one task. So one of the clever ways you can get around this is running, so your user interface tasks all got to run on the main thread of your browser, basically the main thread that does the heavy lifting. But in order to improve kind of time to interactivity, you can run everything else. You can run in a background thread, like a worker thread, essentially. And that'll basically communicate with, so you've got your main thread going along, and then you communicate off tasks that then feed back in. This actually makes your overall time to have a fully loaded web page slightly slower, because you're obviously sending information off and having to wait for that to come back. But it allows the main thread that's delivering your interactive graphics, your imagery, your text, etc., to keep working. So you end up, it's a bit of a trade-off, but you end up with a slightly slower overall time, but a much faster first input, so people can use your site quicker. And again, we bring in deferring stuff again. So just deferring stuff you don't need running with first content paint gets deferred. Below the fold, worker threads, and third-party scripts are a big one. Third-party scripts are traditionally one of the things that always holds us back getting perfect Lighthouse scores, with the absolute irony that one of the things that's always prevented us getting the best scores is Google's own analytics tracking code, which tells you a lot, really. But deferring that kind of script work till later on helps push that time to interact down. So we basically just want to minimize the initial load and defer everything you can. That's the kind of the short version. And the last one is the most probably complicated in a way, which is the cumulative layout shift. It's quite easy to understand. It's quite hard to measure and test. This is one of the things that does appear in your Search Console results. So it's really good to go and have a look at this to see which of your own pages and resources are causing these problems. Because it's basically when, if I click an element on a page, I don't want that page, or Google doesn't want that page to shift around unnecessarily, because it will create a poor user experience, because I'll click something, think that I'm being presented one thing, but actually I've shifted something, and now I'm looking at a different part of the screen or a different part of the page. And then I obviously have to go back to where I want to. I've got an example of this on the next page, just because it's a really kind of top level example, but it shows you how it works. So this is much less about implementing some fixes and much more about kind of just making sure your pages are structured in the correct way. So giving size attributes to your media, so your images and stuff, that means that it will always have a dedicated reserved space on the page, which means that it doesn't matter what side the browser's loading at, it's not going to push anything out the way. So it's always going to have basically a clear-cut box. This is where this image goes. It won't go here, it won't go here, it will always go there. Another design will never insert content above existing content. So never have any element that clicks. You know, obviously you drop down tabbed content or something. You never want that to be pushed upwards, because then you're moving all of the elements on the page. And a cheeky way to get around this is if you do need to use some kind of this, use a transform animation, so that you basically take a user and you show them, so you know, an arrow folding up that shows them that the content is moving up the page, so that they know, you know, because there's fringe cases where you will need to use these, but it is very fringe. Generally, you just want your page to follow a logically descending order, where any button brings stuff below the click anywhere. The most common times this will cause problems is actually when you, let's say you like add something to cart or something, and you've got a banner that comes up at the top of your screen going, oh, order £20 more for free delivery, something like that, where what you've done is you've introduced this new element above that's then going to have pushed everything down. So the person that's just clicked the add to cart button is now on a different part of the page. So I can give you an example to kind of see how this works. If you click this yes, place my order, or no go back button, it brings up this, let me just pause this for a second. It brings up this pro tip, check out faster using the app, which means that instead of pushing the no go back button, they now have just submitted an order. And obviously that's creating a really bad user experience. That's a very extreme example, of course, but even on a smaller scale, just creating these kind of additional barriers for people to read your page is just a really poor experience for them. So those are the three new things that need to kind of come into your lighthouse audits. Interestingly, the biggest of all the kind of metrics is still the speed. That's still where everyone is kind of falling down on, and that's really comes down to just optimizing for all kind of browsers, all devices. So I'll just kind of summarize, reinforce this, like page experience, but they're vital to basically creating a better user experience of the web. And that is what Google's kind of big drive is. They want people to find the correct content, safe content that works well, delivers the function, because that's at the end of the day what a search engine exists to do. So obviously we want to make sure that we're always delivering that experience for our users. And the advantages of this for us, it's not just about our rankings and ticking this box for Google. It's actually going to reduce our bounce rates, increase our conversion rates, as well as increasing our rankings. So ultimately, just implementing these things is going to increase your sales. And there's reams and reams of research that if you improve user experience by a second, you'll increase your conversion rates by 0.5 or a percent, depends on the industry. So getting on top of this stuff is kind of really important. And obviously, if you need any help, let us know. Hopefully that was relatively short and painless for everyone.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for that. It's very informative. I just had one question here. You just mentioned that it's not only about how it will affect your rankings, but in layman terms, what do you think this Google update will do to rankings?
It's an interesting one because Google's obviously had done over the years has unleashed some big updates on us that have had massive effects. I think that this one's going to be similar to when they started the mobile first index, and we saw anyone that hadn't been optimizing their site for mobile or had a poor mobile performance saw quite a massive and rapid decline and had to do a lot of kind of catch-up work in the 6 months following to recover their rankings. A lot of sites I've looked at, they never recovered from that. So I think it's that thing, because Google's kind of signaled this update that, you know, they make a lot of algorithm changes all the time, but actually, you know, this one, they've told us, you know, you need to do this. It's a bit like when they told us we had to do HTTPS. Anyone that didn't got penalized for it. But most, yeah, I think it was in the end about 70% of websites had switched to it beforehand. So they just sort of kind of saw stable, but a lot of people who didn't saw a big drop off. So
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I hope that you got our three main takeaways here, is what the new Core Web Vitals update entails. Also the kind of new update, how it integrates with user experience metrics, as well as how these updates are going to affect user experience on your website. Please keep an eye out for our webinar series, where we will be delivering a webinar at least once a month. Once again, thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, Sam.
thanks, everyone. Thank you all.